Hello, it's Craig Thompson, and this is the Stratford Slice. Today on The Slice, we dive into the drama of Canada-U.S. relations. Well, it's January 2025, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but we've been on a bit of a hiatus, a bit longer than I expected to be on a hiatus from the Stratford Slice, because I always like sitting down with interesting people and talking to them about the issues and their life stories and things like that. But I have a pretty good excuse. We've spent most of 2024 finishing up a film called Exclusion Beyond the Silence, which delves into the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923, which prevented Chinese families from coming to Canada to join the men who were working here. And our film debuted in November at the Toronto Real Asian Film Festival. And in May of this year, it'll be in Cineplex across Canada, so we're very pleased about that. And I should mention that it's directed by a very well-known Stratford theater artist and director, Kira Logren, and I hope to have her on the show sometime in the very near future to talk about it. But that being said, one of my New Year's resolutions this year was to get back into the podcast world and get more topical on some of the things that are affecting not just Stratford, but the world in general, and everything global filters down local. So I've been very concerned, being a former journalist, very concerned about the way things are going in Canada and other places around the world. And I wanted to have a discussion. When we're recording this, it's Tuesday, January 14th, and just in a few short days, Donald Trump will be sworn in as the next president of the United States. We have a political crisis in Ottawa, or a political vacuum, a leadership vacuum, and we're at a crossroads. And so I reached out to someone I know quite well, who has had a long career in Canada's Foreign Service, and Roy Norton agreed to be on the premiere episode of the new year of the Stratford Slice podcast. And Roy, you've had a very impressive career in the Foreign Service. You were posted to the Canadian Embassy in Washington between 2006 and 2010 in charge of media relations and congressional affairs. You were the Consul General in Detroit, Consul General in Chicago, as I recall. You were the head of protocol for Global Affairs Canada. And now you're an adjunct professor at the Pasili School at the University of Waterloo. And you're also a fellow at the Global Affairs Institute and the Wilson Institute in Washington. So welcome to the Stratford Slice.
It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for reaching out. Timely to have this discussion, I think, Craig.
Yeah, so you're sitting here in Stratford looking out at the drama unfolding in Ottawa and Washington. And just tell me, top line, what is going through your mind now? And can you even believe the turn of events that have taken place?
Well, I have no trouble believing it, but I confess to being somewhat terrified at what's coming down the pike at us in terms of the impending change in the U.S. presidency and the U.S. Congress. In terms of what's going on in Ottawa, the timing of that is unfortunate, but we've had changes of government, or we've had pre-election periods before in which there's been uncertainty, and we'll obviously have to find a way to work through that. That's more manageable in the big picture, I think, than what is necessarily going to be coming at us from south of the border.
When I heard, when Trudeau and Dominic LeBlanc and Katie Telford went down to have an audience with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago back in November, whenever that was, and we heard the reports that, you should be the governor of the 51st state, everybody sort of passed it off as a joke. And somehow in the back of my mind, I said, I don't think this guy is joking. And then he ramped it up, and now we have even people like Kevin O'Leary saying, it's a good idea to have a political union between Canada and the United States. This is the first real threat to our sovereignty in a long, long time. Would you not agree?
I completely agree. Like you, I initially was inclined to assume that this was not serious. And I don't know today whether it's serious or not. Trump likes to unsettle people. He likes to destabilize people. And he may be simply pulling Prime Minister Trudeau's chain and Canadians' chain. He likes to get into your mind. And he's occupying a lot of Canadian minds' real estate, something he knows well, at the moment with this. I call it, to the extent to which you can take it seriously, I call it his Mount Rushmore complex, in the sense that he clearly, given that this is his final term, and being somebody that's very concerned about legacy and image, he would love to be on Mount Rushmore, I'm sure, as one of the United States' greatest presidents. And if he were to double its landmass during his presidency, you'd have to think he'd guarantee himself a spot there. Still, I think it's far more likely that he's doing it to destabilize. He will, in a week, have a lot of other things on his plate, well beyond having fun pulling Prime Minister Trudeau's chain, and he may have a more realistic chance of acquiring Greenland and the Panama Canal Zone in any event, and they may not yield a place on Mount Rushmore, but they would be significant territorial gains that he could tout as a singular accomplishment, and that may content him. You never know.
So you had a ringside seat in Washington in between 2006 and 2010. Talk to me about the checks and balances that were in place at the time, and aren't those checks and balances still there to some measure?
They're still there. I was there before that as well, from 1990 to 94, as a negotiator on NAFTA for 2 chapters that were path-breaking, the investment and intellectual property chapters, and then was back from 6 to 10, as you pointed out, and then was in Detroit and Washington, or Detroit and Chicago, rather. The checks and balances certainly exist constitutionally. They were extremely helpful to us during the first Trump presidency, during the renegotiation of NAFTA that gave rise to the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, USMCA as they call it, because we were able, working with the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives, to secure significant changes to the draft agreement, as it then was, that corresponded with their interests and ours on biopharma protections, for example. And President Trump, having transformed NAFTA into this new agreement, seemed content to abandon the field. The details didn't matter as much as the name change, almost. But now there's, of course, no Democratic majority in either the Senate or the House. All three, both chambers in Congress and the executive are now controlled, not overwhelmingly, but nonetheless procedurally, by Republicans. And so we wouldn't have allies in as critical positions of power and responsibility as we had after 2018, when the Democrats retook the House of Representatives.
Now, all we see are the high-profile visits and the news media reports. But what do you foresee happening behind the scenes that goes on between Canada's embassy and our government representatives and bureaucrats who are working on the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day policies between Canada and the United States? So walk me through what you would see is happening now and what might happen after January 20th.
We're in the process of getting to know all of the nominees for the critical positions, not just at the cabinet secretary level, but at subordinate levels as well, establishing relationships, making sure that they understand Canadian interests. I have a theory, though, Craig, and that is that a lot of the most useful work will actually be done outside of Washington. It will be done by the Canadian consulates. I ran 2 of them over the course of my career, interacting with U.S. businesses and unions whose interests would be potentially very negatively affected if 25% tariffs or even 10% tariffs were to be introduced. I don't think that foreign pleading is likely to have a very pronounced impact in terms of changing the president's mind. And I don't think, given how things are lining up, that subordinates at this point in time are very likely to challenge dictates or perceived objectives of the new president. But if they start hearing from Americans across the country who are going to have to pay a 25% tariff on critical components that they import, or face the risk of having to of Canada implementing retaliatory tariffs against things that they export to Canada, because after all, we're their biggest customer in the world. President Trump seems very focused on imports and not nearly as much on exports, but they create an awful lot of employment in the United States too. And so I'm hoping, and this is what the Canadian network in the United States is organized to do. We've done it many times in the past. I'm hoping that we're mobilizing everybody, making sure that they are aware in detail of how these tariffs could potentially affect them in a negative way, potentially even leading to layoffs in the plants that they operate, and that they in turn will speak out to American leaders, cabinet level, the White House, impressing upon them that this really isn't working for them, and in fact, it's hurting their interests.
Well, let's just look at the region we're in. Southwestern Ontario is heavily dependent on the auto sector. And I can't remember the number, but every day thousands of trucks go back and forth across the bridge to Michigan with auto parts and other components for automobiles. Does the president not realize how integrated the auto sector is?
Well, he said last week, we don't need your autos. They should be made in Detroit. And one of the objectives of a high tariff policy has always been to try to foster industrial development at home, as it were. He doesn't care particularly about employment in Canada, and maybe American presidents don't generally, but usually they care enough about buying power in Canada to be concerned about the state of the Canadian economy. They don't want gratuitously to hurt the Canadian economy. President Trump is feeling all-powerful, it would seem. He may be of the view that the United States can withstand any negative shocks that would associate with the tariffs in the interests of attracting investment from Stratford, for example. If we have, as you know well, in those industrial parks in the southern part of the city, a lot of firms, some of them foreign-owned, some of them American-owned, some of them Japanese, Korean, German, others who have set up here in order to be able to manufacture here and sell into integrated supply chains in Detroit. When I was Consul General in Detroit, I spent a lot of time trying to get Michigan to agree to a new bridge that's going to open next year to carry those approximately 7,000 trucks a day, transport trucks that cross at the Detroit-Windsor border. And we were very mindful of the importance of just-in-time delivery. The big three, and Honda and Toyota and others in Ohio and Indiana, don't care much about where the parts come from. They're quite content to buy them from subsidiaries of theirs in Canada. They simply want to get them to a high-quality standard, on time, not necessitating warehousing. The warehousing is essentially done in the trucks that move from Stratford, for example. And we've got, firms that easily have $500 million in revenues, located right here in Stratford, maybe closer to $1 billion, that are part of that supply chain, who are potentially going to face 25% tariffs on their exports, which could seriously affect their profitability, to put it mildly, and might even cause significant layoffs here with attendant knock-on effects to the local economy.
But to retool and do everything in the United States would take years and billions of dollars of reinvestment from some major American corporations. So one would have to hope that the economic or the industrial leaders in the United States would say, hey, we're going to lose money too because we don't have the resources or the labor market to replace what we're getting made in Canada.
And that's my point about the people who have potentially the most power, the biggest voice, that could impress the president and his administration with the foolhardiness of this initiative are Americans who will have to increase or have to bear the cost of that new investment in the U.S. and essentially forego the benefits of investments that they've already made in Canada.
But it very much looks like, for a matter even of if he's proven wrong, as a matter of pride. Danielle Smith from Alberta was down there at Mar-a-Lago a couple of days ago, and she said, no, it looks like he's going to bring them in on the first day of office. So even if they're his own people in America push back again, as a matter of personal pride, he's going to go ahead with them. Is what I'm reading.
He seems to be a true believer for now. He has this somewhat naive, I would argue, and dated impression of the glory days of tariffs from the President McKinley era of the 1890s, when there wasn't an income tax in the U.S. Governments functioned principally based on tariff revenue, and he may think he could get rid of income tax. He could be the president that would get rid of income tax and instead have foreigners supply this revenue. Of course, it's not accurate for him to be of the impression that it's foreigners who pay the tariffs. It's the American importer who, at least nominally, pays the tariff. Some of that might have to be eaten by the exporter in terms of a readjusted price. It may only come, to your point, it may only come from trial and error, from some big-time economic downturn in the U.S. Brought about by these tariffs that would cause the president to relent, and because he's not interested in presiding over a downturn, he's very interested in this being the golden age of U.S. growth and prosperity. So if he's got lots of experts around him who know and who apparently say, with some hesitancy perhaps, given his nature, that this approach is not sound, it's not the right one, and it could be counterproductive. And he may only learn that from experience. But we would pay an enormous burden in the meantime.
Well, it's very worrying, and he keeps talking about the trade deficit, and the trade deficit is largely fueled, no pun intended, by our energy exports to the United States, because they're not equipped to process the kind of oil that we, heavy oil that comes from Canada. And that's really, if you take out oil from the equation, there isn't much of a trade deficit.
In fact, there's a U.S. trade surplus at the moment. The balance goes up and down, and part of it relates to price, including the value of currency. But certainly Premier Smith, you mentioned her visit to Mar-a-Lago. She was there hoping to secure an exemption for Alberta Energy, entirely understandable given the extent to which tax revenues in Alberta depend on successfully selling those products into the U.S. She seems to be of the mind that there's not going to be any exemption in the short run. But you're absolutely right. U.S. refineries in the Midwest and in the Rocky Mountain states in particular, Northwest as well, are configured to process a heavier oil that is what comes from Canada. Certainly oil sands oil is heavier. The alternative source is Venezuela, and it's a dictatorship and horribly unpopular. It's hard to imagine that the U.S. administration would turn comfortably to Venezuela as an alternative. But these refineries refineries cost $5 to $10 billion to build. You talked earlier about sunk capital investment costs. They are expressing their apprehension to the incoming administration now. There's a fair number of stories about that, because not only would their profitability be hurt, they make 2 or 3 cents a gallon on gasoline and distillates that they produce. It's not a high margin industry. They can't afford to pay a 25% tariff. So they shut down. But then the consumer, Detroit Airport relies for jet fuel on Canadian oil that's refined by Marathon in the Detroit suburbs. Are they going to shut? And this is Michigan, a swing state. There are lots of dynamics here that are encouraging from the point of view of the prospect ultimately for sanity to prevail. But there may be a bit of a delay.
Canada's not in a very good negotiating position right now. It seems that we're a house divided. The premiers all have different perspectives. We have a lame duck leader in Ottawa. You have each of the premiers going down trying to do their own negotiation. Why can't Canada develop a unified approach to dealing with this crisis?
Well, there's not, in the abstract, any harm in Canadian premiers who have developed strong relationships with governors, for example, going and informing governors of the potential implications, downsides of this policy. It would be better if there were a true Team Canada approach, everybody on the same message. Premier Smith clearly doesn't think that the government of Canada attaches high priority to the Alberta oil industry, and she may feel that only she can properly act to secure the interests of that industry. In other words, a Team Canada mantra might not include the same messaging that she attaches highest priority to. It's unfortunate, as we said earlier, that we have this situation in Ottawa right now. Lots of discussion about how this could be allowed to happen and whether the delay in the Prime Minister's decision precipitated this or complicates or compounds this uncertainty. But we have to find a way, obviously, to communicate to all decision makers in America and all influencers in America how it is this hurts them, why it runs counter to their interests, because they're not going to be innately sensitive to any expression of concern that this would hurt Canada, at least not at the moment.
Earlier in your career, you were Assistant Deputy Minister at Ontario Exports, the ministry, the export promotion, right? Mm-hmm. Doug Ford, what do you make of Doug Ford's comment? Initially, he said Canada's not for sale, but the discussion could lead to a new trade deal. Is this going to end up with some? Don't want to call it an economic union, which is what Kevin O'Leary was talking about. But is there potential benefits to Canada of having a much more longer-term trade deal than some of these spats that we're having over, tariffs and things like that? What is the solution? I guess what is Doug Ford proposing?
Well, we thought we had a trade deal that was ironclad, that is pretty recent, developed in conjunction with the Trump administration first time round, that is good until 2036, with the first renewal discussions, review discussions to begin next year in 2026. I think it's probably the case that Premier Ford is coming at this from the point of view of Mexico on rules of origin, the issue here being Chinese components coming into Mexico and essentially being advertised by Mexico as being Mexican origin, being inserted into cars that then can be sold anywhere in the North American market. He is properly concerned about that. He knows that President Trump and indeed President Biden have been concerned about that too. And so he defaulted, I'm hypothesizing here, to maybe we should just abandon Mexico in this and arrive at a free trade agreement with the United States. The problem procedurally with that is that this is not really the opportune time to be negotiating a new free trade agreement with the United States, it seems to me. We're not, as you put it, in a position of strength at the moment. And it may actually be to Trump's advantage to kind of divide and conquer. Instead of Mexico and Canada periodically arriving at a common position, as is sometimes the case now, he wouldn't have to worry about that. He could target Mexico, he could target Canada, and in this scenario in which we each have individual free trade agreements, maybe there wouldn't even be a Mexico-U.S. free trade agreement, who knows, but he wouldn't have to worry about negotiating with two countries nominally equals in a negotiation process. He could just focus on Canada. And I, at the moment, don't think that we would be more easily able to withstand President Trump's ambitions if we were negotiating a unique free trade agreement with Canada. I suspect it's actually to our advantage to have Mexico at the table.
Are there not legal guarantees in the NAFTA agreement that we signed a few years ago that could have some court challenges if it was dissolved?
There are, and there will be. And there will even be legal challenges to the 25% tariffs. But if President Trump were to invoke certain national security...
The emergency...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or, as he did, Section 232 in his first term, asserting that imports from Canada undercut American national security. That was with regard to steel and aluminum. He could do it either way. We challenged that under NAFTA, and we won. And that began the process of the Americans backing off, but not until we had retaliated as well. And finally, they did eliminate those tariffs on steel and aluminum. This time, there's lots of talk of retaliation, and there's every reason to assume that we might get there. But if there's a generalized 25% tariff on everything coming from Canada, already the negative implications economy-wide are going to be much more severe than they were in Canada, much more severe than they were with steel and aluminum tariffs. And if you add to that, if you compound that by the negative effects of significantly higher cost imports from the United States, which is the whole point of retaliation, it's to drive up the cost of imports, you compound the widespread economic implications in Canada. Already, economists are saying that 25% tariffs by themselves, absent retaliation, could well lead to a 2 to 3% drop in Canadian GDP. That almost certainly leads, I don't want to be alarmist, and one can't be precise, but it almost certainly leads to at least 1 million job losses in Canada. That's a 5% increase in Canadian unemployment rate. We go from 7% to 12%. Government revenues significantly reduce. Unemployment insurance costs significantly increase. Meanwhile, we're under pressure to massively increase our defense expenditures, for example. This is a perfect storm in the worst possible way. So if you then layer retaliatory tariffs on that, and you drive up the costs of orange juice and blueberries and everything else that we targeted last time, do you rekindle significant inflation in Canada, which the government is paying a huge political price for having presided over already? This is not a pretty picture.
How soon after January 20th, assuming he makes an executive order, would we feel the impact here in Canada? And how would people in Stratford feel the impact, and how long would it take?
Well, there's some speculation now that what he's going to do is to graduate the application of tariffs. So 2% a month, for example, theoretically, so as not to massively hurt foreign economy instantly and make it less likely that they would be able to afford to buy the stuff that you're selling, maybe so as to give them a chance to come to their senses, as in the foreign country that is, and do the things that the tariffs are ostensibly being introduced to secure by way of policy change. Remember that when this was first raised, it was all about fentanyl movements south.
And illegal migration.
And illegal migration south. And the government has announced a fair number of initiatives designed to curtail both of that. But it morphed reasonably quickly after those initial concerns were expressed into this idea that that they're subsidizing us enormously, because it would seem from President Trump's point of view, if we sell them more than we buy from them, that constitutes an American subsidy of Canada. It's, of course, nonsense. If I go to a Trump hotel and I give them $500 and they give me a room, are they subsidizing me? No, he got my $500. I'm not subsidizing them. I got the room. It's the nature of business. You ask about Stratford. This is going to particularly affect, in the short and potentially enduring terms, the integrated automotive supply chain. Given the amount of employment, I'm sure that I probably could substantiate that there's at least 5,000 people in Stratford, 5,000 jobs in Stratford, maybe closer to 10,000, working in the automotive sector, and or light manufacturing or heavier manufacturing. If they proceed full bore from the get-go, i.e. 25% on day one, then it won't take very long before exports diminish and there are layoffs right here in Stratford, with all of the knock-on effects on, retail and hospitality and so on. If people no longer have their jobs, or they're working shorter shifts or whatever, they have less disposable income to spend on other things that everybody in the city benefits from.
I would assume, with your deep experience in the United States and your studies at Harvard and Johns Hopkins and the Wilson Institute, that you have a lot of personal connections in the United States still.
I do, and I speak with them frequently.
So what are the conversations that you're having that you can share with their feelings about what's happening to their country?
Well, not everybody is a partisan, and a lot of my contacts are more partisan now than they were before. Democrats are, no surprise here, horrified at this whole set of developments. They're horrified, not surprisingly, at the advent of Trump too. They thought that after Trump won, they were done with this. Most of my Republican friends are not as publicly horrified, but they are apprehensive. They're not the kinds of arch right-wing zealots that pretty much constitute MAGA. They are more traditional business-oriented Republicans who think there's a role for government, There are debates always about whether it should be more or less. The costs of regulation should be looked at before regulations are promulgated, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not hopeful in the short run about being able to put a brake on the new administration until time teaches the occupants of these positions that maybe some of their policies need a rethink or a tweak, or maybe even to be sent to the trash can because they're actually counterproductive to U.S. interests. But they will communicate their views, and they will certainly work with industry in the U.S. and unions. I mean, unions have a lot to think about. President Trump made quite a thing during the Republican nomination convention and subsequently of support that he had from the Teamsters Union. Mm-hmm. Teamsters, for the first time, didn't endorse a presidential candidate, national union. If there's significantly less trade, there's a lot less stuff moving around. Who hauls that? It's unionized Teamsters who drive the trucks, who move the stuff back and forth from Canada to the United States. They're not going to be thrilled by this. So we've got the refiners, we have the Teamsters, we have electricity consumers in Maine, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire. Interestingly, the incoming Secretary of the Interior and Energy Czar, Doug Burgum, governor of North Dakota gets a very large percentage of its electricity from Manitoba Hydro, which, if there's no exemption for energy, is suddenly going to be 25% more expensive in the state of the Energy Czar.
In the winter.
In the wintertime. You'd have to think that will ramify, as in that impact will be felt very personally by people who, until he's sworn in, are his constituents as governor, and they're not going to be happy. Some of them may not be able to afford a 25% increase in electricity costs, winter or otherwise. Industry, there's a lot of, President Trump is a big believer in attracting data centers, huge consumers of electricity. In the cryptocurrency industry, huge consumer of electricity. They're all potentially going to have to pay inflated costs for power, and their business plan may have been predicated on a significantly lower cost. Now, we only supply 2 or 3% of U.S. electricity, but it has regionally, it's significant, as in proximate to the border, principally from Manitoba Hydro, BC, Quebec, some from Ontario. Premier Ford has talked about that. Oil, regional implication, and on it goes. So there are sectors that, the softwood lumber, which has been a perennial target, already a 15% duty, potentially now a 25% tariff. Some of our biggest allies opposing these softwood lumber duties have been California home builders who need to get softwood lumber and don't want prices for new homes to skyrocket.
And look at the rebuilding that's going to have to take place in Los Angeles with the tragic fires that have destroyed tens of thousands of structures.
My point exactly. And lumber is a pretty big component of new homes. So it's not marginal. If there's an additional 25% tariff on softwood lumber, or if American producers of softwood lumber feel they can raise their prices because the imports previously had served as competition and caused them to have to keep their prices lower, still profitable, but lower than usurious profits, they may now have free rein to raise their prices, and the price of imports would be tariffed at 25%, and every new home in Los Angeles, and tens of thousands potentially are going to have to be constructed, is going to cost 15% more than it previously, or than it should, which and people don't have insurance in many cases. They're going to struggle to rebuild, and they're about to be told that they might have to pay an unnecessary premium to rebuild a house just because of this policy indulgence of tariffs on softwood lumber. Lots of potential allies, and we need to be targeting every single one of them.
Tell me about the Global Affairs Institute and the Wilson Center and your role as a fellow. What does that entail?
Well, they invite us. You've had my friend and former colleague Deanna Horton on your show. She's also a fellow at Wilson and at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. They invite us periodically on a theme, an issue, to submit our thinking, to do some research, write it up. They then publish it and disseminate it. She does it, I do it. Sometimes we do it jointly. We did a piece jointly in December, and I did one of my own in December with Wilson.
On the topics that we're talking about today?
Yes, the Trump administration, how that will affect Canada-U.S. relations and how Canada conducts its foreign policy was the one that Deanna and I had done a chapter in a book a couple years ago. And we essentially, in a very condensed fashion, updated the chapter to reflect the change that President Trump could cause. Mine had to do precisely with this issue of the only people who stand a chance of convincing the administration that tariffs are a bad idea are Americans who will be negatively affected by tariffs. I don't claim to, or I don't pretend that it's going to be path-breaking or determinative, but it provides some ideas anyway about in the agricultural sector, in the energy sector, in the automotive sector, et cetera, of who we should be speaking to and mobilizing them to speak out in turn.
How did you get into this whole game of politics and policy, and what was your first educational experience that said, I want to work in this arena?
Well, I was attracted to politics, partisan politics, as a youth, to a party that no longer exists nationally, the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada. And I, thought that Robert Stanfield would have been a wonderful prime minister. And I was heavily involved in making Joe Clark leader and subsequently prime minister, albeit way too briefly. I then worked for him for 5 years as his senior policy advisor in his office when he was foreign minister. I did a master's degree in Canadian history at Carleton University. Initially, I'd assumed, Craig, that I would study political science. And it seemed, if you're excited about politics, and I concluded quickly, and this is not to diss political science, I've taught it since, but it's rather more remote from the reality of political life than what history is. I think you learn far more that's relevant about the kind of decision-making, the choices that people face, how they arrive at those choices by studying how things have gone down in the course of Canadian history. At least that was my conclusion. So I did that. I've always been a junkie for U.S. politics as much as for Canadian. There was a day when I could tell you, every U.S. senator, every U.S. governor, how big was their margin, the nature of the composition of their legislatures, et cetera, et cetera. I now make some mistakes if I try to do that, but and so going to the United States was compelling. And at the end of my 5 years in Clark's office, the opportunity arose. Derek Burney was our ambassador in the U.S. He was keen to my coming to the embassy in anticipation of this NAFTA negotiation, because understanding the political dynamic in Washington, what there's tolerance for, what there's deep-seated opposition to, where flexibilities could conceivably be found, trade-offs that might resonate, essentially draws upon the innate talents, to the extent to which I have any, of a politico who could insert himself into the Washington environment and try to suss out some of this information. So that was in part my role there. And I ended up living off and on 16 years in the U.S. from 1989 until I left in 2016. I was back in Ontario, as you mentioned, to be Assistant Deputy Minister, Trade. I did a PhD at Johns Hopkins. I did my Master in Public Administration at Harvard, made lots of connections, and deepened my understanding of systems, of economics, for sure, of international relations theory, wafted in and out of the formal diplomatic network. I was there for 4 years, and then I quit to do this PhD. Came to Ontario, and then essentially got drafted to go back to Washington in 2006 to be the Minister of Congressional and Public Affairs, Media Relations, as you pointed out, during the end of the George W. Bush presidency, and then for the first term of the Obama presidency, and got sent to Detroit, as in was offered the job as Consul General in Detroit, with a mandate from the then minister, get the bridge, because we'd been trying ever since 9/11 to get Michigan to agree to collaborate with Canada to build a new bridge, given the age of the Ambassador Bridge, the current major method of conveyance. But the power of the Ambassador Bridge ownership was such that they'd always been able to successfully deter Michigan legislators from, and Michigan governors for that matter, from taking that step. And I mounted, I'm not taking full credit by any stretch of the imagination for this, but I mounted a 3-year-long political campaign, the width and breadth of Michigan. I was in every community of any size. I talked to every media outlet. I talked to every university. But most importantly, I talked to every business person that either sold stuff into Canada, bought stuff from Canada, employed people whose operations depended on stuff that came from Canada, and who would benefit if there were a new bridge, and who would be hurt in terms of their operations if the old bridge no longer was operational. And we got the agreement in 2012 that from the then governor, and I now, entirely by chance, life comes full circle sometimes, serve on the international authority. It's an order in council position named by the federal government that oversees the implementation of the Michigan-Canada agreement to build the bridge. I've been there since 2019, and I'll be there until 2027 as things currently stand.
And this is the Gordie Howe Bridge, which
That's
was
right.
aptly named because Gordie Howe was, of course, a Canadian who is an icon in Detroit. So
You
that
bet
was
he's an icon in Detroit.
That was the way of pushing it through. But
Prime Minister Harper chose that name.
Yeah.
He, of course, wrote a book about hockey. Prime Minister Harper did. It's one of his passions. And astutely, he recognized, there were some people foolishly who said, I always think of it as the Roy Norton Bridge, which is preposterous. But my answer was, the government of Canada doesn't name infrastructure after anybody who's alive.
Right.
And it seemed like too much of a sacrifice to throw myself from the Ambassador Bridge in the hope that perhaps that would make me eligible. I'm being entirely facetious here, but it's a well-named bridge. Everybody gets it in Detroit or in Windsor, for that matter. We are hockey nuts in this part of Canada, indeed in our country generally speaking, it's appropriate to have a major piece of infrastructure named for a hockey
Legend.
star. Legend, yeah.
So when is the bridge opening? And I imagine his family is very proud of that fact.
They are, and it is to open in the fall of 2026. Essentially, the span has been completed. Minor work remains. There is still work on the plazas in terms of the buildings on either side, but that will be completed also in 2026 with opening sometime in the fall.
So given your experience in the United States and, being a Canadian, looking at what has shifted over the last 30 years, what do you think today sets Canada apart from the United States?
Well, former Prime Minister Chrétien wrote an op-ed just this past weekend trying to make some of those points, as in he was addressing this whole 51st state issue and saying, no, that's not going to happen. And let me give you some reasons why. He talked about how much we cherish our sovereignty. He talked about things like social programs and so on. There's a little bit of a flaw in the Chrétien argument in as much as President Trump is saying precisely, we protect your sovereignty, as in you haven't invested sufficiently to do that yourselves. And he's saying, we pay for your social programs. What he's saying is, obviously, they aren't paying fully or even significantly necessarily, but he's saying you've had the freedom to make choices in favor of child care, dental care, pharmacare, because you aren't spending money to protect your sovereignty. And it's time to get off the pot, forgive the vernacular, and ante up. You're now near the bottom in terms of all the NATO members of the proportion of your country's GDP that you spend on defense. And it's time, if you have to make choices, that's your business. But no longer are we prepared to tolerate you making a choice against protecting your sovereignty in favor of more social program indulgence. So anyway, we have social programs. It used to. Why do a lot of those American, Japanese, Korean, German, or for that matter, Canadian firms choose to operate in Stratford when their principal market is Michigan or Ohio or Indiana? Part of it's got to do with nationalized health care. Instead of having to pay a premium of $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000, $12,000 a year per employee for health care, which is what they have to do for their employees in the United States, it's paid for through tax revenues. That's a huge advantage to Canada in terms of attracting investment. It's an entirely different model. They like theirs, at least people with full access to healthcare in the United States seem to like theirs. But 500,000 Americans go bankrupt every year because they can't pay their medical bills, and essentially nobody in Canada goes bankrupt for not being able to pay their medical bills. So that's something that distinguishes us for sure, in addition to all of the other social programs that former Prime Minister Chrétien was talking about. More tolerance of diversity. We are a more international country at the moment in terms of the nature of our population, where it is they've come from as a result of immigration, legal immigration programs. We have very comparatively little illegal immigration. The only guns we have, for the most part, come north across that border. So we're not nearly as prone or as susceptible to gun violence as Americans are. We don't have a Second Amendment to our Constitution right to gun ownership, which is, of course, something that's a feature or a bug of the American Constitution that always intercedes when anybody tries to ramp back the high distribution of guns in the United States. There are many things that we are a member of the Commonwealth and La Francophonie. There are 70 or 80 countries between those two groups, because some are members of both, that we have institutionalized historic relationships with that the United States has with none of them. Now, the U.S., by virtue of being the superpower, has relations with everybody, but not necessarily ones based on historic friendship or commonality of interest. There are lots of things about Canada that are worth clinging to and heralding, and certainly we're being provoked right now, all of us, to think in terms of why we treasure being Canadian, if perchance there's any seriousness to this 51st state notion that President Trump is. Polls show that 90% of Canadians are not interested in becoming Americans, and 80% of Americans think that this is a Canadian call, as in it's for us to decide, not for America to suddenly decide to appropriate Canada. So there's no public support in either place for any kind of measure to forcibly or otherwise make Canada the 51st state. I don't even know how we could. Two senators serving a geographic area bigger than the entire United States of America. How is that even manageable?
Let's look beyond North America for a second, because global geopolitics are shifting quite alarmingly. Do you think Canada has been too complacent? You were at Foreign Affairs for a long time, and I'm just wondering, were we ready for a lot of these political shifts that have been taking place in other parts of the world?
Oh, not as ready as we ideally would have been, should have been. Not as ready as we ideally would have been or should have been. It's an interesting fact that the current government has been very internationalist in its rhetoric, but hasn't really made the investments in diplomatic capability, for example, that would be consistent with increasing our influence and information gathering capabilities abroad. And the previous government wasn't especially interested either. So we've allowed this to wither on the vine a little bit, and I don't have a lot of confidence that this will change regardless of the outcome of the upcoming Canadian election, given the huge number of demands on resources. But we have to acknowledge, I think, that we're not equipping ourselves maximally to take advantage. One of the arguments that Deanna and I made in the Wilson Center piece in December was that it's distinctly possible that America is going to become less popular in the world as a result of the behaviors that President Trump is signaling. It's already the case that China, given thuggish behaviors sometimes, has alienated itself from parts of the world that it appeared to be making inroads in, which isn't to say that they couldn't recover. Maybe they can pivot. Maybe they're nuanced as well, but they don't demonstrate a lot of nuance day in and day out. The Russians, likewise, have behaved in a pretty aggressive manner in a lot of places that they've been. So there's scope, we would argue, for so-called middle powers, Canada, Germany, Japan, Korea, France, the United Kingdom, Australia, South Africa, India, to put down much deeper tentacles into the world, into a world that maybe isn't very happy with the choices that they seem to have, or just doesn't want to make a choice between China and the United States, for example. But that takes significant significantly greater diplomatic capacity than we currently have. We can maintain the relations we have, but if there's a real opportunity out there to grow them, we're not especially well positioned today to take advantage of that, I fear.
Well, let's wrap this up, Roy. It's been great talking to you, but I want to end this in an amazing conversation with you to talk about Stratford. What attracted you to Stratford, and what role do you think Stratford has to play as a small to medium-sized municipality where there's a lot of interesting conversations taking place?
I'd been coming here when I bought in 2014. I'd been coming here for going on 40 years, every year, sometimes more than once per year, to the festival, to theater. But when you're here for the festival, you get to know the city. And I spent a lot of time walking around, thought it was delightful, went to restaurants, bought stuff at shops, and experienced other cultural fare as well, whether it's summer music or chamber music or the symphony. It goes on and on. It's really quite remarkable. I was finishing up my career in Ottawa and had gotten out of the Toronto housing market. And when you get out of the Toronto housing market during a period of inflating home prices, it's not easy to contemplate getting back in a place that you'd be comfortable living in. I wanted, as a second career, so to speak, to pitch up at a university and find some things to do that would be meaningful. But I didn't want to live in Waterloo or London or Guelph or Hamilton, which were the possibilities. And so Stratford is convenient. As it happens, I have a couple of gigs at the University of Waterloo. It's a 45-minute drive. I go in once or twice a week. I've got a couple of offices in different places there, and have gotten heavily involved since in other community things. I'm on the board of the Stratford Perth Community Foundation, for example. I do citizenship ceremonies, as in I preside at them in the region on a volunteer basis, another way of giving back. Those are truly delightful. But it's a real city. I would go, I shouldn't, it's not fair, I suppose, to compare and contrast Stratford and other theater towns, but it's not a theme park, Stratford. It's a place consistent with the discussion we've just been having, where real people make real things, in addition to the entertainment that's provided in the festival and other cultural fare. So, and it's manageable. It's so easy to get around. I can do all kinds of errands in the course of an hour on foot, and how convenient that is, and how affirming it is to not have to waste time. You have more of life to enjoy here. Anyway, it was attractive on a number of different scores, and a place that was attractive to me was available to buy, and I bought it. I rented it out for 5 years while I was still in the U.S. and in Ottawa, and then came to occupy it. I've got a dog walking around 4 or 5 kilometers a day. This city, along the river, it's glorious, and so it's just perfect in my view. And so many people come here. Friends visit. They visit from the United States. They visit from Ottawa, from Toronto, from elsewhere. I spend more quality time with them by virtue of living here than I ever recall having done when I lived in Ottawa or Toronto, because they come for 2 or 3 days and they see theater and so on. And I've gotten involved with Stratford Economic Development on investment attraction, for example. This is, as I said, a place where real people make real things. It's heavily connected into the universe that I worked very closely in Michigan and even in Chicago, as in all of the states of the upper Midwest. And so companies that are here are actually companies that I had worked with when I was there. It just seems like such a perfect fit. Craig. It seems, even though I hadn't lived here before, it seems as if I'm destined to feel at home here almost more than I can imagine feeling at home anywhere.
Well, it's great to have someone of your knowledge and depth living here in Stratford, and you've been very gracious to give me your time on this podcast. And I think we'll have you back from time to time if things continue to be as dramatic and interesting in the political sphere. It'd be great to have you on a regular basis.
Well, I'll certainly be happy to come back. I hope that the picture is maybe a little bit rosier the next time that we meet, and that we're not facing such bleak circumstances or clouds as we seem to be at the moment. Let's cross our fingers and hope.
Well, great insights. It's been very, very insightful. And Roy Norton, thanks very much for being on the Stratford Slice.
Thank you for having me.